I'm Nigel Vanderlinden. This is Collaboration is Culture podcast, exploring how we work together and how to make it better. Today, my guest is John Estafanous, founder and CEO of RallyBright. John and his team publish an annual Future of Work study entitled Inclusive Collaboration at Work. This year's study surveyed 1,500 working professionals about 6 key variables of organizational collaboration and inclusion, examining the correlation between job satisfaction, turnover intent, and an organization's climate of inclusion and collaboration. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
John, let's start with definitions. What is inclusive collaboration? Perhaps we know these concepts separately, but what does that combination, inclusion plus collaboration, mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what we like to think about when we talk about inclusive collaboration is collaboration is kind of what we do. That's how we work together on a daily basis. Inclusion drives how we work together. So when we look at inclusive collaboration, we wanted to look at the what in terms of how do we tactically work with one another and what are some of the things that a lot of managers know but find a hard time to quantify or to clearly talk about, and how do we define those? And then when we talk about inclusion, we wanted to talk about how we actually work together and how people view the environments in which they work and how that contributes to the overall results. So by taking those two together, we've created that inclusive collaboration model by which we believe organizations can run in the most optimized ways.
So why is it important? Why should we care, and why now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one we have been focused on for quite a while now. So when I started RallyBright about 5 years ago, we were really focused on team performance and team dynamics, and how do we provide the science and the software and the skills to help managers optimize the performance on their teams and optimize how their people work together. What we realized in around 2019, so about 2 years into it, is there was a piece missing. And that piece was really around that, how do we actually work together and what are we trying to accomplish? So the concept of inclusion and belonging, I think a lot of times people mix it in with diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, which I think is right. But oftentimes a concept like diversity turns into a checklist. Are we hiring people from different backgrounds, of different genders, of different geographies, what have you? What we wanted to focus on was the behaviors that allow for teams and organizations to embrace diversity and to leverage the power of diversity, of experience, of thought, of backgrounds, all of the various components. And we started pitching the idea, and we launched our first instance in 2020. And obviously there was a major groundswell in 2020. The world changed on so many different levels. And the concept of belonging became even more important. Embracing diversity came to the forefront as being critical for cultural reasons, but they've always been there for business reasons. And we wanted to be able to add something that allowed for people to really dig a little bit deeper and to empower managers to understand how they can take this abstract thought, which isn't just a checklist, and implement change within their teams and within their organizations.
What insights really surfaced for you and your team in the 2022 survey?
Similar to 2021, is inclusion is such an important predictor of things like job satisfaction and turnover intent, as well as people's psychological safety at work, what have you. So the biggest trends that jumped out, we kind of knew this and it makes sense when you think about it, but the inclusion side of things, the how we work together, is the biggest driver of both job satisfaction and turnover intent. So organizations that show up as highly inclusive by those two factors, the ones that show up in the top 25% of the survey, as well as our work, turnover intent's in the single digits. So people wanting to leave is like 2.4%. That
Wow.
jumps up 5 to 10x in the bottom 3 quartiles. So from that perspective, that was a core insight. What we also found was the concept of belonging. And oftentimes people wonder, like, can you have belonging if you don't have psychological safety? We don't have to go too deep into that. But the concept of belonging, feeling like my contributions are valued and implemented within an organization, and my connection with my peers and my colleagues is strong, that was actually the biggest predictor of job satisfaction. And once again, if we look at the two quartiles, job satisfaction jumps by 32% for folks that feel like they belong within an organization. And
Wow.
for me, that's just such an easy win.
Substantial.
Yeah.
Was there any, let's say, differences between teams that worked primarily hybrid or remote or teams that were in person?
Yeah, in 2022, we actually found that teams that were remote or hybrid actually had a greater sense of inclusion and collaboration than teams that were in person. Now, there's a hypothesis around this that we're still figuring out the return to office, and the rules are still kind of being developed as we're experiencing this now change back to whatever this new normal is going to be. So I think there's some uncertainty around the new normal. But what we did find is that, yeah, those that are working remotely tend to feel more included, and they feel more collaborative. That being said, for those organizations where return to office is happening or where people are working in office, we found one of the biggest drivers of inclusive collaboration was actually your relationship with your manager in the office, which is, I found that fascinating, because you would think it would matter more if you're remote, but for some reason it was more impacted for those that went back to the office.
And why do you believe that is? What is your hypothesis?
I think there's a lot of value where people put a lot of value on physical FaceTime and being able to have those hallway conversations. I feel, if you can get a, good job or a face-to-face time with your manager, it kind of, oftentimes it'll invigorate you or maybe frustrate you, but at least you'll feel a little bit more connected. So I do feel like that's probably a big driver of it. And then one of the things that I think is worthy of exploring is, when you return to office, or if you're in office, how does that affect the quality of the meetings you have with your manager? So is it the anecdotal side or is it the productive side? That's something we'll probably be exploring in the next study.
Fascinating. John, how do we know if we're collaborating inclusively or not?
Yeah.
Are there objective or subjective indicators to tell us?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you're kind of hinting at the whole reason we built the model that we do. We like to look at the specific behaviors that drive those various dimensions that we talk about. So, for example, let's talk about collaboration, and one of the dimensions that we measure is cooperation, and this is where most organizations and teams have been struggling, just across the board, ours included. And when we look at cooperation, we start to look at specific behaviors and how do we actually start measuring, are we a cooperative and collaborative environment? And we broke that down to things like, do we have role clarity? Do we have clear lines of authority? Is communication shared effectively? Is it clear communication? Are there little to no barriers between sharing information across the organization? So that's how you begin to measure. So for each of, so we actually broke it down to 6 dimensions, 2 for inclusion, 4 for collaboration. You look at the behaviors that you're fostering in the environment and how individuals rate that environment, and you can begin to really get granular, right? Not just on the tactical side of how do we set priorities and define people's jobs and their authority, but also on some of the what I like to say are the softer skills of leadership, like compassion, which actually fits under collaboration and not under inclusion, because compassion is about, do we have empathy and support for one another? And oftentimes you begin to see there are kind of paradoxes there, right? Like maybe we have a lot of empathy for one another, but we don't really support one another in our endeavors. So I can feel where you are, I can feel what you're going through, I understand it, but you got to do it on your own. Or on the inclusion side, and this has happened several times, where we embrace things like authenticity. You can show up as your true self and speak your mind, and that's all good. But we don't embrace failure. So if you fail alone. Well, does that really foster psychological safety? It maybe fosters that illusion of psychological safety. But you have to measure it at the behaviors that drive the results.
Now, I don't mean to distract you from your explanation of these 6 key variables, but you've hit a term, psychological safety, that I think perhaps would be helpful to define. What do you mean, or what does RallyBright mean when you talk about psychological safety?
Yeah, we believe psychological safety is the foundation for trust within an organization. And I think it allows for, or the way we define it is the ability to show up as your authentic self without repercussion in the negative, right? Or without bias. The ability to speak your mind and share your thoughts in a safe environment, meaning that you'll be heard, you'll be respected, and people will actually listen and act upon your thoughts, and the ability to fail forward. So if you make mistakes, are you going to be held accountable for those forever, or are you going to be expected to learn and grow from them, and will that be embraced within the organization? So that's how we define psychological safety.
And what have some of your learnings been from implementing this model with your base of clients?
In an ideal situation, we see immediate change overnight, but that never happened, right? So in an ideal situation, when we implement with clients, the true expectations are we will at first get a baseline. So we will measure where we are as an organization or as a team. Then we will diagnose where are the areas where we can improve upon, and then we will start to take action. So for the organizations we work with, once we've identified or gone through the initial benchmark and they've kind of done their diagnostic, we have action plans to support them to start to make change. So not across the whole board, right? But really specifically on where are the areas where we need the most improvement, or what are the behaviors that we see that maybe don't gel with what we're trying to accomplish, and they start to implement that change. The best case results that we see are that they have lower attrition rates, people feel better about coming to work on these various teams, and they begin to deliver better results. So another key driver that we found is having a shared purpose on the team and commitment to that shared purpose. That's what's going to help teams get through all disruption. And we're seeing that if the first thing that a leader does or a team does coming out of this is define their shared purpose as a team and identify 1 or 2 of those behaviors to start working on, then that's a success, because we know they're going to have less turnover, better business outcomes, and people are going to feel a lot better about coming to work every day.
So who's responsible for creating inclusive collaboration in an organization?
It's a great question. I'd like to say everybody. Part of our ethos is it starts with self-awareness. So part of our model and our implementation includes driving self-awareness for individuals. How do I rate my environment, and what can I do as a person to start changing it or to start improving it? But realistically, it's going to start at either the team leader or from an L&D partner or a DEI champion. Those are the people that are really spearheading the initiative. So I would say inclusion officers or inclusion directors within organizations, learning and development or HR partners, and every once in a while a very astute leader who believes that they want to drive a better inclusive culture. And we firmly believe that inclusive leadership is leadership of the future, and that's what we're fostering.
So if I was one of those leaders listening to the podcast, what are 3 things I can start doing immediately?
3 things you can start doing immediately. One is understand, first off, what your biases are. So I would suggest there's a really interesting exercise out there. It's called your Trusted 10 exercise, where you list out who are the 10 people you trust the most, who's your inner circle, right? Just by name or initial or what have you. And then you go through and you identify, okay, what is their ethnicity, what is their age group, what is their level of education. There are a whole bunch of factors you can look at. And more often than not, and when I ran this, it was really interesting. More often than not, you feel like you surround yourself and trust people that are like you to a certain degree. And how does that affect your bias? So number 1 is improve that self-awareness and understand your biases. Number 2 is have an idea of what your shared purpose is, what your purpose is for you and the people that you manage and the people that you lead, and then validate that with that group. right? Like, are we all on the same team? Are we all swimming in the right direction? And it doesn't have to be, I mean, it should align with your organizational mission and purpose, obviously, but it doesn't have to be just that. I'll never forget, I was working with an engineering team, and we started talking about shared purpose, and the thought was, oh, you want to make great code, right? But that wasn't it. Their purpose was, we're working with people that are funding some of the most important heart research in the world. So our mission is to make their lives easier so we can heal more people from heart disease.
Awesome.
Pretty compelling for an engineering team, right? So that's number two. And then number three, I would say, learn about psychological safety and understand how you can foster that within your team. And it's not easy. As leaders, you're burdened with responsibilities on a daily basis. You have to hit your numbers. You have to ship these things. You have to do whatever, the things that made you a leader that you're responsible for, but you can't do it alone. So make sure that your team feels good about what they're doing and feels like they can be themselves doing what you need them to.
Are there any hacks, let's call it, to achieving psychological safety, or to rather begin the journey of creating an environment of psychological safety for your team?
I think the best hack starts with that self-awareness and vulnerability. If you can't be vulnerable, you can't really expect anybody else to be. So, and I'm not just talking about the softer side of vulnerability. I'm talking about, look, nobody's perfect, right? As leaders, we make mistakes. But can we own up to those mistakes and then show how we're feeling forward? Can we be honest about how we feel about that experience? Or can we be honest about even the challenges that we have? Now, it doesn't mean you have to share absolutely everything and anything, but it means you have to exhibit the behaviors that will foster psychological safety in the team so they can exhibit those behaviors.
John, in the pre-interview, we talked a bit about why now? Why is this the moment for inclusive collaboration? And you provided, I think, a three-part answer. One was with respect to the current environment of hybrid and remote. The other was, well, we're entering into a period of uncertainty, and there's a number of sort of subpoints to that. And then the third was recognizing we have a generational workforce.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about those three items in answering the question, why now?
Yeah, I'll start with the generational workforce. I mean, we're at a time where I think we're going to have 5 or 6 generations in the workforce. And one thing we know, and this isn't our data, this is just public data out there, the younger generations entering the workforce now, they're not going to tolerate the typical, we're just going to manage to the numbers and we're just going to, deliver results for Wall Street. Like, they want to know they're part of something that's driving change, making the world better for them and others. And I think that's absolutely critical. So having that purpose, having the right environment, having the ability for people, for all generations to show up as themselves and work well together, I think is absolutely critical. In terms of uncertainty, I mean, listen, it's now we're kind of more in economic uncertainty versus pandemic uncertainty, but we're constantly dealing with disruption, right? We've all probably had more disruptive lives over the last 2.5 years than we'd like to say any other time in our generation, but it's also not unique that there's constant disruption. And how do you build resilience, and how do you create the right environment so that way your teams can be resilient through disruption, I think is absolutely critical. So it is interesting when we think about remote and hybrid, but going back to disruption first, there was an interesting lesson I learned very early on. And it's all around, how does environmental stress affect performance, right? So I could be an astronaut, I could be a world-class athlete, I'm neither of those, or I can be somebody who just feels a lot of stress when I'm, doing day-to-day activities. Whether you're in these extreme situations or whether you're in your situation, your body still reacts, your mind still reacts to that fear or flight mentality, right? So being able to manage disruption, I think, is absolutely critical. And to do that, it helps to have a roadmap, and it helps to have a way to identify where you're feeling those pressure points and then to be able to address them. So I think that was the disruption part. And then the hybrid remote, it's all different. And our data is showing all sorts of funny, skewy things that ring true when you get to them, like what you asked me earlier, like, coming back to work. Why is it that the relationship with the manager is more important? You would think that if I'm remote, I would want to have the best relationship possible with my leader. Maybe for remote workers, it matters a little bit less because it's all about the work and they can do things on their time and their schedule and they don't have to have those meetings by the water cooler. So I think we're still figuring that out. And if we want to figure it out in the most effective and impactful ways, then we've got to have the right environments that foster the ability for us to figure it out. And that's where inclusion and collaboration comes in.
I like your point, or I like your hypothesis about perhaps remote workers being more self-sufficient. I've certainly heard similar sentiments from other thought leaders in the space about how teams are more autonomous, quite frankly, that the manager is less there to manage and now more to remove obstacles and ensure that their team is well resourced. Anyway, maybe something to explore in another podcast.
Yeah, I think it's worthy of digging into for sure, because I do think it has changed and nobody really has the rule book. And then also from an equity standpoint, like if I'm a manager and I'm treating people differently who are in office versus remote, or if, like how do you begin to balance that, right? There's somebody right around the corner who I can just walk down the hallway and have a conversation and think something through, or do I need to pull everybody together for these certain activities or decision-making activities? I
think it certainly makes the role or act of managing or leading much more intentional.
Yes, 100%.
One of the points I'm not sure we covered thoroughly, and John, you can keep me honest here, is the 6 key variables that are essential for organizational collaboration and inclusion. I think it's important for you to outline sort of like in your model, these are the 6 key variables.
Of course. When we talk about, as I mentioned, collaboration is really what we do together. How do we actually work together on a daily basis? We have 4 dimensions there and then 2 dimensions measuring inclusion. So starting with inclusion, you've heard me talk about these 2 things. Psychological safety is absolutely critical. And for psychological safety, we look at authenticity. Can you show up as your authentic self? Speaking up. Are you comfortable speaking your mind? And then embracing failure. Can we learn and fail forward? When we talk about belonging, which is the second part of inclusion, we talk about contribution and connection. So contribution is, are my contributions valued? Do I feel like I'm being embraced from a work perspective in a way that aligns with the work that I'm doing? So for example, am I just being asked to check boxes, or am I actually contributing to our shared purpose and mission, right? And then the second part of belonging is connection. How connected do I feel with my colleagues and my workers? Do I feel like I can communicate effectively with them, that I can trust them, and what have you? So psychological safety and belonging are inclusion. And then under collaboration, we have alignment, which is all about that shared purpose. Have we defined that shared purpose as a team or as an organization? And then also commitment. So it's great to define it, but you also have to be committed to it. And your behaviors have to align with that shared purpose and mission. We talk about cooperation, which is where most organizations and teams are struggling. And this is cooperation we define as role clarity, how communication is shared, is communication clear, is it effective, and is knowledge shared seamlessly and transparently within that team or organization, or in the right ways. And then we get into, as I mentioned, the softer side of kind of how we work together, or the work that we do together. We look at compassion as a component or a dimension of collaboration, and that is about empathy and support. Do we have empathy for one another, and do we support each other? And that's where we often see we have empathy, but we don't have support, which is something you can change pretty quickly. And then finally, under collaboration, we look at fairness, and this is really the only place in the model where the word diversity shows up. We look at, are we objective? So can we look past our individual biases, which is why I said the first hack was to do that trusted 10. And then embracing diversity. Do we actually embrace divergent and diverse viewpoints and thought processes and solutions, and implement them and give them the proper weight and create everything that you need to actually make diversity effective. Because it's really easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's a hack, I would say, to just check boxes, to say like, okay, we are diverse. But unless you actually embrace diversity and you have the other components, you're not getting any of the benefit of diversity. And if people don't feel included, you're not truly running a diverse organization.
One of our advisors is famous, at least with us, for saying including is not inclusion. So the very fact that we have a diverse audience doesn't necessarily mean that they're included. In other words, that not only are they able to freely speak their mind, but in fact, the organization is hearing it and taking action on it.
Yeah. So that's where that contribution is so important, and that embracing of diversity is so important.
John, the 2022 report also surfaced some insights around technology's role in inclusive collaboration. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of seems fairly basic at face level, but essentially what we found is when people felt comfortable using collaboration tools or remote work tools, they felt more included within an organization. So if it's easy for you to hop on a Zoom or a Google Meet or a Teams meeting and not have too much switching pressure there, because I know I do sometimes, and maybe it's because I'm old, then it really is. To me, the hypothesis is that it helps remove the obstacles to getting to the behaviors that we want to manifest as an organization. So if the tools are enablers versus obstacles, and if I feel comfortable with the tool as an enabler, then it's going to help how I perceive my environment.
Certainly interesting and something that we subscribe to.
Yeah.
John, where can listeners read the complete study?
They can go to RallyBright.com. I believe we have a blog post on it, and just go to the inclusive collaboration section of the website, and it'll be right there.
Awesome. And how can listeners continue to stay in touch with you and RallyBright?
Always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and just, always happy to connect there. Just John Estafanous at RallyBright. And then it also happens to be my email, just john@rallybright.com, JOHN@rallybright.com.
Easy. John, fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for sharing the results of RallyBright's 2022 Inclusive Collaboration Study. It was a real pleasure.